Hello, Mike Cook here, and I'm here with another issue of Anti-Doping Updates. This is episode 12. Today, we've got three great stories to talk to you about. First is about a boxer who violated the terms of his suspension. Next story is a cyclist who had issues with an athlete biological passport. And third, we've got the story of a country that is most likely out of the Olympics for weightlifting. Okay, let's get started. First story is Michael Ogunda Odhiambo. He's a welterweight boxer from Kenya with a 15-12 record. This is an interesting case because it answers the questions of what happens when an athlete is suspended due to a doping violation and decides to compete anyway. In December of 2017, Ogunda submitted an in-competition urine sample that tested positive for cannabis. Under the rules that were in effect at that time, he was sanctioned for 4 years. Nowadays, that's a substance of abuse type of thing, and he would only be sanctioned for 3 months. But anyway, he was sanctioned for 4 years beginning in 2017. Nevertheless, in February and November of 2018 and in January of 2019, Ogunda fought in boxing matches in Swaziland, in Georgia, and in Las Vegas. And that evidence came before the Kenya Anti-Doping Association from a whistleblower. Unfortunately, he lost all of those matches. So Ogunda did not respond to the notice of charge that was issued by the Kenya Anti-Doping Association, and the matter was referred to a hearing before the Kenya Office of Sports Disputes Tribunal. So so this question brings up the issue of what are the parameters that an individual can do when he's been sanctioned for an anti-doping violation. And here's what the World Anti-Doping Code says about that in Article 10.12. It says, no athlete or other person who has been declared ineligible may, during the period of ineligibility, participate in any capacity in a competition or activity other than authorized anti-doping education or rehabilitation programs, authorized or organized by any signatory's member organization, or a club or other member organization of a signatory's member organization, or in competitions authorized or organized by any professional league or any international or national level event organization, or any elite or national level sporting activity funded by a government agency. So that's what the Anti-Doping Code says. The Office of Sports Disputes, in their decision on this, did not make any kind of finding about the boxing matches that Ogunda did participate in. We don't know if the matches were under a WADA signatory, because there's definitely some boxing organizations that are not WADA signatories. Were they under a professional league, an international or national elite level competition? The Office of Sports Disputes kind of glosses over that part. They found that Ogunda had willfully participated in boxing matches when he was sanctioned and had a high degree of culpability, and so they sanctioned him for an additional 4 years of ineligibility set to run after the end of his first 4-year period. So the consequences of participating in a sport that's under a WADA signatory when you've been sanctioned by a WADA signatory are quite high. Like Mr. Ogunda has experienced another 4 years of ineligibility on top of you're already sanctioned. Okay, the next story is about Mehdi Sorabi. Mehdi Sorabi is a road cyclist from Iran, the most successful road cyclist from Iran. He competes with the road team Pishkaman, and he won the UCI Asia Tour in 2010 and 2011. And this case is interesting because it involves issues of an athlete biological passport. The UCI measures the ratio of hemoglobin and reticulocytes. And if these are out of a prescribed range, that is considered an atypical biological passport finding, and the individual is subject to sanctions because of that. So in January of 2008, Sorabi submitted a blood sample which the UCI expert panel analyzed and concluded that was an atypical finding because the ratio of hemoglobin and reticulocytes was out of the normal range. And they concluded that there's only two plausible explanations for that. One is either a prohibited method, meaning taking your own blood out and putting it back in later, which is prohibited under the World Anti-Doping Code. Or second, using EPO, which is a prohibited substance. Either of those will cause that ratio of hemoglobin to reticulocytes to be out of normal range. So the UCI, based on that, sanctioned him for 4 years, and Sorabi appealed to the Court for Arbitration of Sport. In his hearing before the Court for Arbitration of Sport, Sorabi argued a couple things. One, first he argued that the sample that the UCI was basing their result on was not his sample, it was someone else's. Second, he argued that the UCI should have lifted his provisional sanction and shouldn't given him a sanction prior to his hearing with the Court for Arbitration of Sport. And third, he argued that the samples weren't collected in accordance with the international standards for testing and investigation, which is part of the World Anti-Doping Code. And therefore, since the International Standards for Testing and Investigation, ISTI, since those weren't followed, then the results should be thrown out. So when the Court for Arbitration of Sport analyzed this, first they dismissed the challenge to the provisional sanction. They argued that Sorabi hadn't appealed that decision. He'd only appealed the decision to sanction him for 4 years, not the decision to provisionally sanction him pending the outcome of the hearing process. So they got rid of that issue right away. The next issue was with the ISTI. Sorabi argued that there were concerns with privacy, concerns with hygiene, and his ID and other people's ID weren't checked during the sample collection process, those being violations of the ISTI. The Court for Arbitration of Sport said that it wasn't sufficient to show that there's been a violation of the ISTI. Sorabi would have to prove that there's some link between the violation of the ISTI and his positive test, or atypical finding on the athlete biological passport. The Court for Arbitration of Sport found that Sorabi hadn't proven that, and so therefore they dismissed that argument. The next thing the Court for Arbitration of Sport looked at was Sorabi's claim that the sample wasn't even his. They dismissed that issue also. They found that Sorabi had signed the doping control form, and the chain of custody was present with the doping control form and the sample. Since he'd signed it, that means that was his sample. So, interestingly, the court also noted that UCI would have to prove that the high hematological value is not sufficient proof of doping, and the UCI had to prove that doping is a plausible source for the abnormal athlete biological passport, and that other explanations could be excluded. And so that's what the UCI did in this hearing. They found that the only plausible explanations for that ratio of hemoglobin to reticulocytes being out of the normal range, the only possible explanations were either intentional blood doping, meaning taking your blood out, putting it back in later so that you have more red blood cells, and therefore more ability to absorb oxygen and compete in road cycling better, or the use of EPO, which also changes that hemoglobin to reticulites ratio. Those are the only two plausible explanations for that ratio being out of whack, and therefore that's sufficient proof. And the Court for Arbitration of Sport agreed with the UCI. And so Sorabi is sanctioned for 4 years for the athlete biological passport violation. Okay, the next story to talk about is Romania and their weightlifting team most likely being out of the 2020 Tokyo Olympics. That's not so surprising news. They were already had their weightlifting team down to 1 man and 1 woman instead of the four men and 4 women that some other countries have. But in order to understand this story, it's first we need to backtrack and talk about how the World Anti-Doping Code works. So the World Anti-Doping Code, in order for a international federation to be in the Olympics and other major sporting events like Pan Am Games or Commonwealth Games or Asian Games or multi-sport events like that, the international federation would have to have anti-doping policies that are consistent with the World Anti-Doping Code. And the World Anti-Doping Association has model rules that international federations can adopt. Much of the provisions are standard provisions the International Federation has to adopt verbatim, but there's some provisions where the International Federation has some leeway and can adopt rules that are sufficient, that are tailored to their organization. So for example, what substances are prohibited, that is a standard list that the international federations can't change. The consequences of an anti-doping violation are also standard things that a international federation can't change. However, some things that they can change is for example, who is considered an international athlete and is included in a registered testing pool. That's up to the international federation to define for themselves based on the nature and the needs of their sports, because some sports have much higher participation and more athletes than others, and they can define them how they want. So another thing that's left up to international federations is the consequences if a national federation has multiple anti-doping violations during a period of time. The way that works is up to the international federation. So now let's turn to weightlifting. The International Weightlifting Federation had a rule in 2017 that said if a member federation had 3 or more anti-doping violations in a calendar year, then the federation could be suspended for up to 4 years and fined $50,000 to $500,000. So the threshold was three anti-doping violations in a calendar year would trigger these consequences, and it was a strict liability offense, meaning it didn't matter how culpable or negligent the national federation was with respect to its members. So in 2020, the IWF came under a lot of scrutiny and criticism from the International Olympic Committee for the amount of doping violations that were present in the retests from the London 2012 and the Beijing 2018 and the London 2012 Olympic Games, also their corruption scandals. So the IWF was under a lot of criticism. In 2021, the IWF published their new anti-doping rules, as all international federations were supposed to do, because there's new anti-doping code going into effect in January of 2021. The IWF did this without really any explanation at all on their website. They just posted their new rules without explaining any of the changes. And one of the changes that they did was they drastically weakened the consequences to member federations. Instead of 3 cases triggering the consequences, the International Weightlifting Federation changed their new policy to 4. 4 anti-doping violations in a calendar year triggers the consequences. And the fine is up to $300,000, so less of a fine. And it's no longer a strict liability offense. It's based on the degree of fault or negligence of the member federation. So those are the changes. So nevertheless, now with that backstory, that brings us to Romania. One other change that the IWF did is they delegated their results management authority to the International Testing Agency, which is an independent nonprofit corporation that provides services to international federations. And the International Testing Agency recently concluded their retesting of samples from the 2012, and they announced that 2 more lifters had tested positive. So that means that all 4 lifters from Romania from the 2012 have tested positive for steroids. And those are Gabriel Sincron, who failed to post a total in the men's 85 division, Razvan Martin, who won bronze in the men's 69 category, Roxana Kokos, who was silver in the women's 69 kilo category, and Florian Crotoru, who was 9th in the men's 56. So all 4 lifters from Romania that were in the London 2012 Olympics have tested positive, and that means there's been 4 in a calendar year, and now Romania is subject to sanction. So the next step is for the IWS independent member sanction panel to decide on the appropriate sanction and fine. Most likely that means that Romania is going to be out of the 2020 Tokyo Olympics, and it also means that Nicu Vlad, who is the president of the Romanian Weightlifting Federation and a technical official, he won't be able to participate in the Olympics as a technical official. And that's it for the anti-doping stories for this week. Let me know in the comments what you think about these cases, and I hope you're having a great day.